Hello, everyone, and welcome to the part three. Welcome to part three of the session that we had on the leadership during COVID series, where we have Agostino Renna coming back again, who works for Amcor, and he has actually shared with us and me included this idea of four global megatrends that has to do with how things have been moving and how COVID is reshaping certain things. So we've had a discussion about globalization, and we had a question about sustainability, and now we're going to talk about the next trend, which is all the idea of internet of things and all the craze surrounding it, the big industrial 4.0 kind of revolution. So Agostino, again, thank you very much for sharing and sharing your insights and taking your time with us as well.
No worries. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure, and it's nice to be on again. Look, this is, I think, an interesting topic. I'm not a big fan of buzzwords in general, and I think that this has become probably one of the biggest buzzwords of our generation, certainly. This idea of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Everything, in fact. And one of my personal pet peeves is that it's a space that tends to have maybe some unnecessary creativity, right? Where we have solutions looking for problems to solve. You know, I recently moved into a new house, and when we bought our appliances, you know, we went to the store, and they were explaining to me how I can connect to my dishwasher with my iPhone, and I can, you know, send it commands, and it can send me statistics from the dishwasher to the phone. And I think that's, you know, one manifestation of the Internet of Things. I still can't quite figure out why or how it's useful, but it is interesting to know that I could probably call my dishwasher if I'm feeling lonely in any way, shape, or form. No? But
I like it. That having a conversation with your dishwasher. So
exactly. So, but look, on a more serious note, I guess what I would say is, to me, this topic is really about the coming together of the digital and the physical worlds. And it becomes enabled by two important kind of technological streams of development. The first is gigantic advances in computational power and the ability for computers to do amazing things. You get into statistical analysis, you know, artificial intelligence and that kind of stuff. And then the other area or body of work from a science and engineering perspective is the area of sensors and any kind of device that can capture information. So when you combine a super high level of computing capability with advances in sensing technology and the ability for physical devices to relay data back to supercomputers, if you will, you end up with a space that, in my view, is really, really ripe to be harvested. So it's really the coming together of the physical and the digital worlds. Now, my personal view on this is that this is probably one of the biggest productivity platforms that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution. It's different in terms of the quality of what this is, in terms of its ability to enhance productivity. But more than ever, I think the thirst for productivity is like we've never experienced it before. And if you really take a step back and you think about just an economy of any country, there's really two drivers. In the spirit of oversimplification, there's really two things that drive the GDP of an economy. The first is sort of the size of your working age population. So there's a demographic quality to your economy that matters. So the size of your working age population. And then the second is the relative productivity of how you do the things you do. And so if you think about it from that perspective, in this race to GDP growth and economic growth and economic advancement, those really become the two things that most people go after. And you could argue that one is far less flexible than the other, right? Your demographics are your demographics, generally speaking. However, on the productivity side, there's an area that is ripe for investment and innovation and what have you. So I think this is how this all connects, in my view, is you have a world that wants to go bigger, better, faster every single day. You have economies, and now more than ever in the midst of this global pandemic, and we'll get to that in a second in terms of what all this means. But there's going to be, in my view, an ever increasing thirst for economic recovery, economic growth. And if you can't really pull on the lever that is demographics, then the lever you're going to pull on is productivity. And as you pull on productivity, one of the main interesting things that you can look at is the enablement that comes with or from this concept of the Internet of Things, where you're really driving the combination of physical devices and physical machines with smart decisions made by computers at an astronomical speed. Right.
Indeed.
So let me pause there and get some reactions.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things which I wanted to just add was I was recently talking to some other people. You said two things which has led to this explosion, which is exactly what they said as well. That is more computational capabilities as well as the more ability to do this. But the third thing, of course, is the cost of you talked about sensors and the cost of doing these things. But the third thing which they mentioned is the fact that it's become so much cheaper to actually store data than what it was before. You pull these three things together. Now, that is one reason why they say they're talking about this. And I'm probably going to touch on this later on, is the fact that it's not that you cannot do all these three things, but to make and drive that productivity, and I'm really going to pick your brains on that one, is you need the human capability to try and make sense of all the data and computational stuff that you're going to come up with into a parlance that is easily understood by your customers as well. So when you said, I'm doing all this, but the question is, yes, you're going to talk to your dishwasher or you're going to take them, but that's only one part of it, right? Because the idea is, how do I program my dishwasher into asking the most meaningful questions? That becomes the billion, trillion, zillion, whatever it is, that question. And the capability is still not there in most organizations to be able to deal with it. Now, of course, you can always link it to demographics, saying that demographics is, you might want to do this. Now, the other question about demographics is, what does this mean if more and more of these works of productivity is going to go up, but if more and more of these jobs can be done by so-called machines, it goes into the fundamental aspect is, how do I take care of those jobs that might be made redundant? Some of them, you can always talk about the fact that, okay, you can actually reskill them and stuff, but maybe not all of them.
Sure.
Now, the question is, what does it mean for society? And maybe that's not a topic that we can address now, but it's a big topic about what are we going to do for those people? Are we going to give them a universal income, a kind of a fixed income? And I don't want to get into that kind of political debates, but it really raises that part. But I'm more interested in understanding, when you talk about this, I like the fact that you said it's just one of those buzzwords. Let me ask you this. So if you don't like these buzzwords, what are your thoughts on digital transformation then?
Oh my gosh, I'm not even going to touch that one. But let's get to that in a second. I guess what I would say is a couple things. I mean, you referenced data and the cost of data storage coming down significantly. The cost of data harvesting, if you will, or data acquisition is coming down. It's coming down significantly. I guess my view on this is that data in and of itself is essentially useless. And so the race isn't necessarily to the data. I think there's a constant iterative loop that needs to happen. And to me, it's data to information to insight to decision-making. Data, information, insight, decision-making. And to the extent that and that decision-making should lead to an action of some sort. And that action can be automated, meaning that it's a machine that is taking that action on the back of the data, the information, the insight, and then some algorithm tells the machine, do X, do Y, do Z. Or it's a human that receives some form of signal that says you should do A, B, or C. And I think that's where the value is, more so than in the data. And oftentimes, that's really where I think these conversations sometimes fall down, is that data, for the purposes of data, is essentially not really worth a whole lot. And so I always, my basic question is, what problem are you trying to solve, or what opportunity are you trying to address? Because you should start there and then back into some of these available tools whether it's computers or sensors or other, to be able to take advantage of that. One other point I would make, which I think has been really accentuated and punctuated on the back of the COVID pandemic, is COVID, I think, has rewired our thinking on a lot of things because we've been forced to. And, we talked about globalization and how that will potentially shift, the move towards localization, local supply chains that have business continuity plans or optionality. We talked about that in the first episode that we did. In the second, when we talked about sustainability, we really we put a lens on kind of our learnings as we watch the planet heal on the back of us kind of reducing a lot of the activity, this push towards minimalism and how we've learned that we have far too much. So now I get to the Internet of Things, and look, what I would say is, in the pandemic, many people had no choice but to trust computers, okay? And let me use my parents as an example. My parents are in their late 70s, almost 80 years old. My mom is now buying groceries online, okay? And pre-COVID, you would never ever have envisioned that this lady would, sit at a computer and order her groceries online and have them shipped to her doorstep. So for those people that were kind of spooked by this whole world of digital marketplaces and e-commerce, this crisis has given us reason to believe, and it's taken us forcefully out of our comfort zone and put us in a spot where we now believe in the power of some of these internet-enabled practices, if you will. So I think, and I'll make this last point and then I'll pause and get your reactions. I think the world comes out of this pandemic a lot more friendly to all things computer, internet, e-commerce, digital marketplaces, and sort of computer-enabled stuff that before we would have said, nah, I'm not doing that, right? But now we've experienced it. We did it safely. We've noticed, I think, how convenient some of these things are. And coming out of it, I think some of that will stick. I think some of that will stick.
I really love this argument, because for me, that's what is the next question I actually would have had for you. If this had been like a Q&A and you'd been in an MBA class or things like that. The idea is that, let me ask you this. So your mom is now doing things online. Great. That's something to make her life easier, right? Or not easier. She has to deal with the fact that I have to have something to eat. I need to do this. I cannot walk out. Now, let's come into the workplace. Let's talk about the fact that you're going to have these smart systems that's going to be telling you what to do. To what extent is this transition going to make people feel anxious? Because there's one thing about sustaining yourself and doing this, but in the workplace, I am only confronted with a lot of people saying that it was in the context of digital transformation, where IoT would be one part of it and AI would be another part of it, where the definition I'm getting a lot, and that could be applied to the example of IoT, big data, and everything else, is this is going to fundamentally change the way we are going to be working, which means process changes. And we all know that humans are what we call cognitive misers, are lazy fundamentally. They don't want to change. So now, to what extent are these kind of things, this move, COVID, or even before that, digital transformation was already putting a lot of people who are becoming anxious. Maybe some of them were anxious that their jobs would be made redundant, or if they had to change the way they work. See what I mean? Anxiousness is one part which is not going to be good for productivity, because either they might push away these kind of new changes, so they might decide not to adapt it, or they might not change their behaviors. Worse, they might decide to leave your organization, which is in some cases is not the purpose of why you're thinking about all these productivity improvements.
Correct.
That's one side, right? The other side could be pure distraction, saying that, oh my God, I'm going to be focusing on things, I'm going to be worrying about things which I should not be worrying about. So I would really like you to address those two as a leader. How would I address anxiety? And then how would I also address distraction? I hope I'm making myself clear.
No, it's completely clear. Look, I go to basic principles, and I think history is always a good way to try to contextualize the future, right? You can take a look back to try to understand what might happen in the future, because I fundamentally believe a couple of things. One, human beings are relatively predictable over time.
Yes.
In a large time horizon, human beings are quite predictable. The second is that human beings have been evolving, upskilling, retooling, reinventing for the history of humanity. And so I'm always one to bet on progress and change and the ability of human beings to adapt to progress and change. So, and it's interesting, Deva, because if we were having this same conversation in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, I bet there would have been very similar questions. Mm-hmm. What happens to my job? Mm-hmm. Are all of our jobs going to be eliminated? And in fact, as you play that out, what you notice is that jobs changed. And yes, some jobs did go away, but others were created and people retooled and reskilled and moved forward. So I guess I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm always inclined to bet on humanity to sort of advance, change, and adapt. Now, the point I would make to your specific question, we are the group that is caught in the midst of this transition, meaning our inclination is to remain stationary, figuratively speaking, when the momentum is to keep moving in the direction of all of these different types of, you think about smart manufacturing, smart factories, artificial intelligence, all of these buzzwords that we hear, but that are all designed to basically accelerate and amplify what we currently do. I'm a firm believer, by the way, that technology is not a replacement of human ingenuity and human endeavor. I think it's an amplifier of human capability. And that's an important principle. You either believe in that or you don't. There's some people that believe that machines can replace humans. Okay. I don't think that's the case. I think that machines, whether it's a computer or an algorithm or a software, is really an amplifier of human capability. And if we think about it that way, then really what it comes down to is making sure that the human starts to evolve together with what the machine is able to deliver. And then from that perspective, sort of mankind advances. So I'm not pessimistic at all about all of these things. Last point I'll make, and then I'll pause, is that the next generation that comes in behind us, Deva, our children, they're going to be far more digitally native than we are. They're going to be far more comfortable with many of these concepts than we are. And so to an extent, we're in a little bit of an inflection point where there's a generation that feels like they're caught in the crossfire of this transition. But as that generation works its way out of, from a demographic perspective, works its way out of the workforce, I think the group that comes in after us will feel far more comfortable with these topics than we do.
Absolutely. Right? And I love the answer. But for me, the one thing which I want to ask you, and your opinion, eventually you can definitely take a shot at it as well, is when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, the time between innovations was spread out enough for people to make adjustments, right? If we talk about evolution, if we talk about species, they've had a lot of times thousands or millions of years to kind of evolve, right? But unfortunately, the technology is advancing at such a fast pace, right? To the point where people just don't have time to adjust. Now, I'm not talking about what we're doing at the workplace, at the home. At home, we have a choice of whether we want to avoid it or keep away from it or adapt it. Whereas at work, we don't have the choice, right? It could be adapt or perish, or let go. Now, I'll make a point is that about the digitally savvy Z generation or whoever is coming out right now. But for them to come to the workplace, you need to have mentally stable parents who are aware that this is going to happen. They should not feel concerned. They should be able to parent their kids through this point. You also run the other risk of completely dehumanizing things. Yep. Which could be the problem that we have. So it's not that I want to be a pessimist, but for me is that it comes down to leadership, either at society level or at organizational level, about how you want to kind of communicate. And that's what I really want, because you're absolutely right. I completely believe that we should look at this for a positive reason. I'm a big fan of the algorithm from Amazon, which tells me that people similar to you watch this because it just makes my job easier and probably better. But at the same time, I'm thinking in a workplace, I also want to make sure that if I am leading a team, I want to make them feel assured that we are doing this, but we are invested in your growth, because you are critical for the next generation. Because if you have people anxious and they go home and take it out on their children.
Sure.
So that's my question to you. So from that viewpoint.
Yeah. So look, as a leader, and I say this, I often have the opportunity to speak to either entry-level university students that are thinking about their career, or high school, soon to graduate high school, and they ask me a lot of questions like, what should I study? Should I be an engineer? Should I be a lawyer? And I think those are good questions. What I answer them sometimes underwhelms them in terms of the simplicity of my response. I think that in today's environment, and if you go back to when I entered the workforce, and it's not 100 years ago, it's 20, 22, 23 years ago, your knowledge of content is sort of what carried you for a good portion of your career. You were an expert in something, okay? In my case, I became a sales guy. I was half decent, and my career progressed based on what I knew how to do in that domain. Today, and this is where I connect to the leadership kind of lens, is you're far better off to hire people that know how to learn than people that are specific experts in a particular area. Now, of course, if you're going to be a brain surgeon, you got to have knowledge, right? I'm not saying I'm not saying that you should go there and say, hey, I'm okay to learn on the fly here. If you're going to design and build jet engines, you need a certain level of content knowledge. But the point I'm trying to make is that the new kind of super skill in today's work environment is the ability to learn. So I often tell these students, kind of don't stress about the content, right? Because if I go back in my own career, I'm a degreed engineer that never really did hardcore engineering work.
Well, that makes the two of us.
Yeah, and so, but what has been helpful to me is that at their core, engineers are experts at learning and problem solving. And in today's work environment, if you can come across as someone that is addicted to learning and problem solving, it's highly likely you'll do well. So when I hire today, Deva, and when I promote today, and when I surround myself with my leadership team, I look for people that have an inclination to learning and a thirst for doing new things, experimenting, because that's going to be the currency of the future. Because to your point, the rate of change of business today is astronomically faster than it was 15, 20, 25 years ago. So just when you think you have this thing figured out and you want to lock in the variables, the second you lock in those variables, they're already obsolete. I have this conversation often around business planning for businesses, right? 3-year strategic plans, 5-year strategic plans. Then you have an operating plan that pitches out, a year into the future. We still do that almost in a ritualistic way, right? Corporations do that. They have a strat planning process. They have an operating plan process. I'll tell you, man, like we build our plans and we lock them in 3 months or so before our fiscal year starts. And the second the year starts, 70 to 80% of our planning assumptions are already either different or in some instances obsolete. So it does speak to the point to, as a leader, make sure that you create a ripe environment for learning, exploration, experimentation, and that you create space for failing forward, failing with a purpose. Okay? And I think that's the leadership of tomorrow. The leadership of yesterday is, I'm the smartest guy on this topic. I have 20 years of experience, and so I've seen everything in my life already. And when I look at something, I go into my computer bank, my brain, I recognize it as something that is familiar or something that I've seen before, and I automatically pull out a playbook that I go implement. Okay? Think about some of the challenges we're seeing today, this pandemic. Okay? What leader has been taught how to lead through this pandemic? You teach in business school, right?
Yeah.
There's no textbook
Indeed.
that tells you how to navigate this. So what do? You learn in real time and you make decisions. And those decisions, are maybe 80% correct. But when they're 80% correct, you pull the trigger and then you pivot, you adapt, you calibrate, you move forward. So this comfort with not knowing all the answers, this comfort with not having to solve for 6 decimal places of accuracy, this comfort with, I may get this one wrong and fail, but I'm going to learn and move on. Those are the attributes of the leader of the future.
Indeed. Let me ask you this, Agostino, because one of the things that I'm a firm believer, everything that you say absolutely makes sense. I'm a firm believer that give me a person with the right attitude towards learning, towards experimenting. I would take that person over any other person if I had ever been in a position where I had to recruit or promote people as well. I'm not in that position, but I have a preference towards students in that way. But as a leader, I envy you and don't envy the difficult position that you're in, because one of the things that you talk about, and nobody can necessarily train you for a pandemic like this, but you can kind of anticipate the changes coming to the workforce because of all the things we're watching. Pandemic has made it maybe faster. But where, as a leader, are you going to emphasize on work-family balance amongst your employees, right? Because as a leader, it's very myopic for you to just think about productivity amongst this team right now. You're also thinking about what you want to do. And that's kind of sustainability linked to what you were discussing earlier, is I have to not just think about this, because by employing or by making and giving meaningful work to the people within my organization, I am not just contributing to this generation, I'm actually maybe contributing to the future generation and the well-being of that as well. To what extent do you think that is also something that you should keep in mind as a leader?
Yeah.
And pandemic is one part, but it applies to everything that we're talking about, this trend of IoT and digital transformation.
Look, you're hitting on something that I have a ton of passion for, and it's the following. I think that the leadership of old viewed the strength of a contributor on their team by the amount of time that they put into what they did. Okay? So, I can remember bosses saying, boy, that guy's terrific. He puts 18 hours a day, works weekends, never sees his family. This is a true quote. In one company I worked at one time, they said, man, a true company man. He's been divorced 3 times for this company, 3 times. And, I'm sitting there going, you may as well go just like jump off a bridge, right? I mean, that's the classical definition of failing in life, in my view. But anyways, that's a different topic. So the point being that what you learn is the most effective way to manage this is to manage to outcomes versus activity. And when you manage to outcomes versus activity, what you tell your team is essentially either stated or unstated. Look, I believe in your ability to get the job done. And if you are uber productive and you could get it done in 4 or 5 hours, and versus having to sit here for 12 hours, then knock yourself out. Life is too short, I think, Deva, to spend too much of your time doing something that you either don't enjoy or depriving yourself from something that you do enjoy. And I think you need a certain level of maturity in your own career, because if you were sitting here with the Agostino of 20 years ago, my answer would have been very different. I would have said, no, I do need to work 80 hours a week because I need to prove to my boss that I'm committed, that I want to grow my career in advance. And then you get to a point where, in my life, in my own personal life, it was the arrival of my children, where you kind of sit there going, boy, there's probably something bigger and broader than the job that I do, from 8 to 6 every day. So when you bring that kind of empathy and perspective to your job as a leader, what you try to do is create an environment where people never need to apologize for having a life outside of work. And when you do that, it allows them, back to your earlier point, to then be the right kind of parent to their children. They're present, they act as mentors, they provide guidance.
Absolutely, indeed.
And now you're sort of grooming and developing the next generation of people
Absolutely.
who, by the way, will enter the workplace inherently with that empathy installed in them.
Absolutely. And of course, the idea is that when you do this, in my opinion, you're also creating the right leaders within your own organization, right? Because these people will bring the same work ethic. They're more likely to treat their subordinates the way they would treat their family members, have that kind of approach. Now, it's amazing that we started off with this IoT, but I think it's such a big trend that IoT, we just said IoT, but there are factors that in different companies, IoT might not be relevant. It could be the new digital transformation, new ways of working. And I think from that broad perspective, but it becomes more of from a leadership perspective, it also is, yes, we can do all this. Yes, we can do a lot more. Yes, we need to have the capabilities, but let's not forget that when this happens, we have to think about the people who have to undergo this change.
Correct.
Who may not be paid as much as we are, for whom this transition might not be as easy because they also have other things in their mind. And this, from a leadership perspective, is realizing that this has ramifications rather than just the technology in the workplace itself, but linking it back to sustainability. That's what I really think, that you need to go back, and sustainability is not just about the planet. It's about sustainability of social sustainability of what we do within our organization and for the people working for us in our society. So
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I find it somewhat ironic that the more productive we become, the more fast we become at everything we do. It almost feels like the less free time we have. And it's somewhat ironic if you think about it. If you take a step back and say, think of the advancements that we as a human species have been able to develop and deploy over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And if you ask, the generation or two before us, they would tell you that they had far more free time, and that, family was kind of the center of their activity. And yet you could argue that they were far less productive than we ever envisioned being. So how could they be less productive and have more free time? It's counterintuitive. Indeed. It's counterintuitive. So some of these things are the choices we make, in my view.
Indeed.
And I'm of the belief that the next generation will see these items very differently than we do.
Absolutely.
Very differently.
Absolutely. And I look at the way that I used to call my father a workaholic. He was the 18-hour-a-day man. Luckily, he didn't go through divorces and stuff like that, but not 18 hours, but make it 12, 13 hours a day and that kind of stuff. And I tell myself I am not the same because I work far less. I'm being more productive, but I find myself doing a lot more. The idea of productivity and the idea of what we do with free time is also being redefined every time that we do new things, because there are new things being put out there in terms of accessibility, availability, and that kind of stuff. So I think we redefine everything. We redefine quality of life at every stage. And we look back at what other people have said, did they really do it that way? And I said, I'm not going to work on a Saturday or Sunday. It does not mean that I'm not working hard the rest of the week. Right. But except that we redefine it every time. And probably the next generation is going to be lucky enough to say we're going to have a 3-day weekend rather than a 2-day weekend, which means that on those 4 days, they're going to be hyper productive. Because if not, you cannot afford to have those 3-day weekends. And essentially, it's fundamentally the changes that we have. And I think that is the kind of things that, if you have the right kind of leaders in the workplace, you're going to be making sure that you have the right kind of employees who are going to impart the right kind of values in their kids, who then are going to become future leaders of organizations and countries and societies. And I think that is what is the need of the hour now, more than anything else. And I think that's one of the key takeaways that for me was that we started out with Internet of Things, but I think it's much more critical that we realize this COVID is just one lens by which we're looking at.
It is. It is. And I think, so, to bring this sort of to a close here, we did start out with this notion of the Internet of Things, and then that led us to the discussion on productivity. Because the Internet of Things, in my view, is probably the most formidable productivity platform we've seen in a long, long time. And then, from productivity, you get to this notion of work-life balance. You get to the notion of how do leaders kind of navigate in this new world of hyper productivity and people wanting a little bit more balance between the time they spend doing their jobs and the time they spend doing things that are not their job. And look, again, as I said earlier, I'm an eternal optimist, and I'll always bet on humanity. I'm brought up that way. I actually think a lot of these forces that are acting on us right now are good. I even think the COVID force was good medicine for us. And for sure, it's incredibly unfortunate that we had people get sick and people die. So there's no debating that. But what we've learned on the back of this pandemic, in terms of what really matters, in terms of how we can continue to nurture relationships through technology, like you and I are doing here in this interaction, and the things that really are important versus less so, the materialism and learning to live with less. Some of this, I think, was important medicine for a lot of us. And I'm convinced that we come out the other end, maybe not spiraling back to exactly where we were before, because I think we will spiral back a little bit.
Absolutely.
We tend to have very short memories as human beings, right? But I also think that we'll grab a couple things from this experience and be different moving forward.
Again, a wonderful conversation, Agostino, and I look forward to our next conversation. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and stay tuned for the next session with Agostino. So have a wonderful, productive time between now and the next session.
Perfect. Thanks for having me.